So today I want to talk about Reconstruction. The most widely read book on it by Eric Foner is subtitled America's Unfinished Revolution, and I want to talk a little bit about today why he entitled the book that. One of the reasons I want to give this talk is that I often hear people saying, you never hear much about Reconstruction. Somehow it falls between the cracks, and I think there's some reasons for that. I know when I'm teaching the first half of U.S. history as a survey class for undergraduates, my joke is often I have to get Lincoln to the theater, right? That's sort of my script for the semester, and it's hard to leave much time for Reconstruction. And I think those who teach the second half of the U.S. survey, which has been split at somewhere around Civil War and Reconstruction since the early 20th century, and now there's a whole lot more to cover, they feel it more and more difficult to go back to Reconstruction. And I'll also say that there's also a certain truth that for a long time in the cause of national unity, it was probably best not to talk much about that period because it would get people from the North or the South somewhat riled up about the aftermath of the Civil War. So maybe just to let sleeping dogs lie might be another reason why that period is not as well sort of known and appreciated as other periods in our national past. I will say that 10 years ago, and I can't believe it's been 10 years ago, when I was giving talks on the sesquicentennial of the Civil War, I gave a two-part presentation on Reconstruction, and so you'll forgive me if today I'm going to have to try to boil it down into one talk, and it's going to make me focus on some things a little bit more than others, but during the question period afterwards, which I certainly always look forward to, if there's something I did pass over rather briefly in your mind, I'd be happy to elaborate on any of that. So I think when I try to teach the Reconstruction, part of the problem is that there are some real difficulties in getting your head around it as a period. Technically, we define it as the 12 years following the Civil War, although in some ways it began during the Civil War itself. And one of the problems is it goes through three very distinct phases. The first phase, which again starts under Lincoln during the war, and I prefer to call each phase after who's in charge of the process. I think that's an easy way to sort of think about it. So early on, the president was in charge. First, Abraham Lincoln and Andrew Johnson, as I'll talk about in a few moments. And then from 1867 to Redemption, I'll talk about that in a minute too, Congress was in charge. And then finally, at the end, the Redeemers, that is those white Southern Democrats who had run the South before and during the Civil War, they call themselves Redeemers. When they take back control of their state governments, that is usually called redemption. And so each one of these phases is distinct. It's very unlike the other ones, and I think that makes it difficult. If that weren't bad enough, it gets even more complicated because you have to remember what's going on in each phase. So a thing that I like to tell students is there are three key questions that you can ask. And the beauty of these three questions is in each phase of Reconstruction, the answers to all three questions will be the same during that phase of Reconstruction. And these are the three questions. How many rights should there be for blacks in the South, for freed people? How much change is going to be demanded in the South society and politics in order for them to rejoin the Union? And finally, is it important that a Republican Party be created and be sustained in the South during and after Reconstruction? And so we have this sort of swing back and forth. Lincoln would have answered all of those questions with a mild yes, with a conditional yes. Yes, but I'm willing to work in certain ways. I might have some flexibility. Johnson would be kind of a mildly no. Mostly I'm against those things, though again, I might have some flexibility in certain areas. Congress that takes control in the second phase, it's a strong yes to all three of those. They demand that all three of those things occur before Reconstruction can come to an end. And then when the Redeemers take control back of the White South takes back, their answer is a strong no. So it's almost like a pendulum swinging one way and then the other. And if you're not careful, you can get whiplash during this journey as things change on a dime. And that, I think, also is very difficult to remember who the players are and what stage we are in Reconstruction and who's in charge. That makes it more complicated as well. And there is one final complication, which I'll come to that later. The last complication in Reconstruction is this question of redemption. It doesn't occur at the same moment in each southern state. So in some southern states, it happens as early as 1869 or 1870, and the process of Reconstruction comes to an end. In some states, it does not occur until 1877. So while we have 3 phases, we also have 13 different stories of when Reconstruction ends. That can create some confusion in your mind. And so I'm going to try to keep it relatively simple, but I just want to suggest that this is why in a course on the Civil War and Reconstruction, we generally spend 5 weeks on Reconstruction, because if you go into the details of all this, it can be truly a rabbit hole that you can go down. But let me try to make things fairly straightforward today. So let's start looking at presidential Reconstruction. So as early as December of 1863, as Union armies began to make real progress in the South, Lincoln had begun to realize, and some in Congress, that there had to be some plan for what would follow the war, even as the war continued. By the end of 1863, the end of the war most people saw was not near, but it was more likely than it had been a year earlier. 63 is the year both of Gettysburg and Vicksburg, which are signal victories that show that the Union can win this war. But also it's the year in which, in the fall of 1863 elections, the northern population makes it clear that a majority of them are going to support the Union war effort. And that is probably critical to explaining Union victory. So Lincoln issued what's sometimes called the 10% plan. I won't go into a great deal of detail about it, but what he basically said was, if we can find a core of white Southerners who will now claim their loyalty to the Union within a state, they can begin to reorganize a state government and begin the process of moving back into the Union. He said that, in fact, different states might follow different processes. He suggested when 10% of the voting population from 1860 declared its loyalty, that process could begin. But he left a lot of other details loose. He didn't think there needed to be one exact blueprint for how a state would move back into the Union after it was militarily conquered or the end of the war. He began to experiment, particularly in Louisiana, Tennessee, and Arkansas, large parts of which had been captured by Union armies. He began that process during 1864. I'll also say that this was one of the things that he probably had the least success working with Congress on. Generally, they were in lockstep. They passed many things during the war together, like the Homestead Act, Land-Grant College Act, a Banking Act, all sorts of things, the Pacific Railroad Act, they agreed on. But on Reconstruction, he met more opposition. In the summer of 1864, radicals in Congress wanted a much more harsh version of Reconstruction, and they tried to enact their own bill that would have demanded that a majority of a Southern white population had to declare loyalty before they could begin to reorganize a state government, which would have meant, for one thing, this process couldn't even begin till after the war, but also they were going to demand a much harsher peace. And they declared that this would be the only way that a state could reorganize. Lincoln wanted neither the harshness nor did he want the single plan, so he vetoed that bill in the summer of 1864. He pocket vetoed it. At the end of a session, if something's passed the end of the session, it doesn't become law if the president just doesn't sign it. It's called a pocket veto. He pocket vetoed it, and the radicals in Congress were very upset with him. But in the end, they worked through these differences, and by the time the war had ended, in the spring of 1865, there were a couple of things that they could agree on. And it's time for me to turn the page here, and the page does not wish to be turned for some reason. Well, odd. Okay, there we go. Oh, excellent. Okay. So by the end of the war, they'd agreed on 2 basic principles that would guide the beginnings of Reconstruction, that is presidential Reconstruction. First of all, the Republicans in Congress and Lincoln agreed for the need of a 13th Amendment, an amendment to the Constitution permanently banning slavery. His Emancipation Proclamation had ended slavery in areas in rebellion during the war, but it was a presidential proclamation, and he worried that it was also very much a wartime measure done under military necessity, and he worried that a different president or the coming of peace might threaten the permanence of the Emancipation Proclamation. So in early 1865, and if you've ever seen the film Lincoln, that really focuses on that fight in Congress, Congress passed and sent to the states the 13th Amendment, which would be ratified by December of that year. The second thing they decided to do was they decided that something would have to be done for these 4 million enslaved people who suddenly found themselves free. And that was a tremendous transition, that they would have to at least offer some aid and guidance for the first few years. And so in March of 1865, Congress created the Freedmen's Bureau. It has a longer title, but that's what it's popularly known as. And the Freedmen's Bureau was really meant to last for 1 year, and it was meant to do certain things, simple things like help the former slaves sign labor contracts. Now they would sign labor contracts with a person often who maybe had owned them, but now they would work on the land. To do simple things like become legally married, which a freed person could do and an enslaved person could not. To reconnect with family members who they had been separated from and the like. It was a fairly humble federal program. It was meant to last 1 year, and yet it was seen as interventionist and activist and almost unprecedented in American history. And how Reconstruction might have continued beyond April 1865 with Lincoln in command is simply not knowable now. I tend to think it's likely to have turned out better than it did under Johnson. You can't be sure, but I'm ready to roll those dice. And I do think, though, that Lincoln may not have the historical reputation he had today, because this may sound harsh, but there's no better way to become a martyr than to be martyred, right? I mean, his death at the end of the war removed him from the world of politics and what would have been a very messy terrain of Reconstruction. But at any rate, in April 1865, upon his death, Andrew Johnson became the next president of the United States. And he was from the South. The reason he'd been chosen in 1864 is the only member of Congress from a seceding state who had maintained his seat in the Senate. He'd been a senator from Tennessee, and he did not secede because he did not leave with the secessioners because he was from eastern Tennessee, where there was a lot of unionism. And so in 1864, hoping to gain the votes of moderate Democrats, Lincoln's first vice president, one of the great trivia questions of history, Hannibal Hamlin of Maine, was tossed aside for Andrew Johnson to show a certain geographic and political balance on the ticket. And now he finds himself president of the United States in April 1865. And I don't think it's unfair to say that he was woefully unprepared for the task. So before I turn to Johnson, I want to talk a little bit to understand his reaction and white Southerners' reaction generally. I think what's important to do is to move our focus for a minute to the freed people in the South and try to understand what 1865 looks for them, because then it'll be easier to understand how white folks reacted to that. So the Freedmen's Bureau had been created, started to create educational institutions, the Army as an arbiter for fairness in things like labor contracts. And it also, the free people themselves started to do other basic things. This is a marriage certificate from 1866. And John and Emily Pointer, who had considered themselves to have been married since 1844, and these children could not legally be married under slavery because they were property. Therefore, a slave owner's right to separate property could not be sundered by marriage. So slave marriages were not denied of legal standing. In the wake of Appomattox, hundreds of thousands of freed people went and had their marriages sanctified. And here you can see the form, and that's the long title for the Freedmen's Bureau, marriage certificate. It says they considered themselves to have been married on May 28th, 1844, and that they had these children. It was also important to them that this made their children legitimate, right? Because they all came after the marriage. And then they're all listed there, and then the Freedmen's Bureau agent in the South has signed this on I think it says October 20th, 1866. Many of them had the only sanctity of marriage that they'd had under slavery was called jumping the broom. That is, they had agreed, they'd undergone their own sort of informal service in which they'd become husband and wife, but now it had legal standing, and they very much wanted that. A second thing that a lot of the freed people did was they started to seek education, and the Freedmen's Bureau offered education. This is interesting to me. This is the first vocabulary list in the Freedmen's Bureau primer teaching the former slaves to read. And those are the first words they learned. And I think there's something interesting in looking at that list, right? Free, life, live, thank God, work hard, good house. Freed slaves, God should, ought, serve, read, stand, union, ever. It's an interesting list, right? But many of the freed people, some younger children hope to get a real education. There are many stories of older freed people who, they're in their 50s and 60s. They know they are not going to be some incredible writer and orator perhaps, but they wanted to go to learn to write their name, to read the Bible, to do some basic things because they understood that there was power in that education for themselves and even more so for their children. Another thing that I think is an amazing artifact of those days after Appomattox is for those freed people who had some money, it took a few pennies to put this ad in the paper. All over the South, newspapers carried these kind of ads. And it's interesting to think before the Civil War, there were runaway slave ads where masters would publish and say, I've lost this slave and this is where I think they went. Those are replaced now by former slaves trying to reconnect with family members. This is one where a young man named Thornton Copeland is trying to reconnect with his mother. And he gives the name of his masters, where he last knew his mother, when he was removed from her, and does anybody have information that can bring me back together? And one of the things that families desperately wanted to do in the days after Appomattox is reconnect their families. And so we have these in papers that I think give a human dimension to this. Also, some former slaves simply took a little time off in the summer of 1865. They worked their entire lives at the risk or actual punishment of the lash, and some of them wanted to take a break and take what we would think of as a vacation. Here's where the Freedmen's Bureau becomes complicated, because while they did help the freed people in many ways, there was also this demand that they encourage the former slaves to start working the land to get a cotton crop in 1865, because the national economy still demanded cotton and the world market demanded cotton, and cotton needed to come in, yes, as free laborers now, but they were often told, you cannot take time off. You cannot move away. You must get back in the fields and go to work because the crop has to come in 1865. And the Freedmen's Bureau worked very hard to make sure that the former freed people did find a landowner and did sign a contract to start growing cotton for wages now, or later it'll become sharecropping, but in 1865 for wages. These changes are in many ways, from a human perspective, revolutionary. And white Southerners weren't having it. And although they were quite defeated in the days after Appomattox, by the fall of 1865, they were no longer feeling defeated, partly because Andrew Johnson has encouraged them not to act defeated. Perhaps because he got a certain thrill. He came from a very poor background. He was a tailor who didn't learn to read and write until he was an adult. His wife taught him. Maybe the specter or the spectacle of having these rich Southerners come to him and have to bend a knee for a pardon, maybe turned his head a bit, and he began to tell them, don't ratify the 13th Amendment in your state, and go about your business. And if you want to set a series of laws which severely restrict the rights of black people in the South that came to be known as black codes, you should do it. And so in the summer of 1865, under Johnson's encouragement, Southern states began to reorganize and began to pass what come to be called the black codes, making it illegal for black people to own guns, to hold meetings where more than 3 people were present, to own land, to travel freely, to take away many of the rights that they were just beginning to appreciate. And Johnson encouraged this kind of behavior. In late 1865 and 1866, too, one of the things that you do know about Reconstruction probably is the Klan and other organizations with similar purposes and many different names began to organize throughout the South to use terror against those freed people as well. Congress was watching on and for a while did not want to interfere. Indeed, they would not meet until December of 1865 because of the strange way Congress met back then. But they were watching, and in 1866 they became more and more concerned. In May and July of 1866, attempts by freed people to organize politically were met with physical violence. In Memphis and in New Orleans, there were tremendous violent riots by white crowds that sought to attack the freed people and their white allies. Wait a minute, where did it, okay. I have some details on exactly how many people were killed in each of those, but actual people, go back to the riots. People were killed in both of those. Again, white allies and particularly the freed people were attacked and killed in both these riots. And so by mid-1866, Congress decided that they could not continue to let Andrew Johnson run Reconstruction. In fact, had handed back the South to Confederates. And so that first phase of Reconstruction came to a close in 1866. Congress began to respond to what Johnson and white Southerners had been doing with 2 major acts. The first one was simply a Freedmen's Bureau extension bill, which gave the Freedmen's Bureau another year of life. So it was supposed to last for 1 year, it would now last for 2 years. And secondly, to pass something called the Civil Rights Act of 1866, the first Civil Rights Act in American history. And it simply said that all citizens would have equal protection under the laws, and that Congress would make sure that the right to sue in court, to serve on juries, to testify in court, to sign and enforce contracts, to own property, and equal punishment for equal crimes would be the law, and that Congress intended to force that on a national level. Andrew Johnson vetoed both bills. He said if Freedmen's Bureau had been a terrible disaster which had put ideas into freed people's heads that they need not worry with, things like education and notions of democracy and the like were not appropriate for them to have to worry about. And in a strange argument that I could say much more about, Andrew Johnson said that the Civil Rights Act, by giving black folks the same rights that white folks had, was therefore, by its nature, discriminatory towards white folks. Because to think that they ought to have equal rights would be to discriminate against white folks who clearly ought to have superior rights. So he vetoed both bills. Congress overrode both of those vetoes, but it was clear that Congress and Andrew Johnson had vastly different views of what Reconstruction should look like. And so at that point, the contest was on. And and I'm missing a page here, but that's all right. I'll keep looking as I talk. And so it's back here somewhere. Oh yeah, I've sorted them weirdly. Okay, there we go. All right. So what happens is Congress then seeks to take control of the process. So in early 1867, we often say that congressional Reconstruction begins. It's sometimes also known as military Reconstruction or radical Reconstruction. I think both of those names are a little flawed perhaps, but Congress takes control of the process in really a two-pronged attack. The first one is they set out to reshape the South. They feel that what the South had done in 1865 and 66 showed that the white South was not ready to make even the slightest changes before Reconstruction came to an end, and they were going to put a stop to that. So, how to thwart white Southerners' attempt to take back their southern states and how to break Andrew Johnson's power? Well, in a couple of ways. First of all, they passed the first Reconstruction Act. I'm going to pass through a couple of these, okay. Come back to that. First Reconstruction Act created 4 military districts in the South. Each would be commanded by Major General of the United States Army, and about 10,000 U.S. troops were stationed in the South. There is this myth that there were soldiers everywhere. In fact, soldiers could rarely be found outside of major cities in the South, but that is the idea that they were militarily occupied. There's some truth to that, but it can be very easily overstated. The state governments that had been created that had passed the black codes, and by the way, I forgot to mention, had also in the fall of 1865 elected former Confederates to go sit in Congress. And Alexander Stephens, who had been vice president of the Confederacy, was elected in the fall of 1865 to represent Georgia in the House of Representatives. Now, when he and other former Confederates arrived, Congress refused to let them sit because Congress in the end decides its own membership, and they sent them home. But it was a sign that the South was not ready to make real changes. They're sending people who had been vice president of the Confederacy in April, sending them to Congress in the fall, shows that not much change has happened in the South. Those state governments that had been formed in the wake of Appomattox had been supported by Johnson, had passed black codes, and had sent former Confederates in an attempt to seat them in the national capital, were destroyed and replaced by these military districts. This is Congress saying, you're going to have to make some changes before we're going to let you back in as states into the Union. Some of the changes they were expected to make was to repeal the black codes, which many of them forced to do, to ratify the 13th Amendment, and increasingly, they would also be asked to ratify the 14th Amendment. And again, I didn't know how much time we'd have, but not as much as I'd like, so I want to go specifically to the first section of the 14th Amendment. And this is, I would argue, after the Bill of Rights, and also think the 13th Amendment changed the United States in fundamental ways, as did the 19th Amendment by giving the women the vote. This is, I think, doubtless the most significant amendment in all of our history. Because what it essentially says there in the first section is that you are a citizen of the United States, not just a citizen of the state in which you reside. And that means that just because you live in Georgia or New Hampshire or Wisconsin, you cannot have fewer rights than someone who lives in a different state. That is, the national government will protect your rights against a state who tries to limit your rights. That turned the old equation on its head. Before the Civil War, the way most people saw government and rights was that the state or local governments would protect you against federal tyranny. And now the federal government is saying, no, it's going to work the other way around. You are a citizen of the United States, and therefore your rights will be protected by the federal government if a state or local authority tries to take it away. In the short term, it was meant to protect African Americans in the South. In the long term, it has protected the rights of citizens of all shapes and sizes, and in many ways. So it's become an incredible sort of basis of a sense of rights and citizenship in the United States. And so to get back in, some of these states were also asked to ratify The 14th Amendment. Enough states, northern states passed it quite easily, enough states passed the 14th Amendment that it entered the Constitution in 1868. It was ratified. Now, along with this attempt to slow down the process, to create military districts and to slow down and to ask for more change before southern states would be readmitted to the Union, there was also a more direct attempt to break Andrew Johnson's power. He had, once he was fighting Congress, he had gone, I'm going the wrong way. Okay, here, sorry. When he began to fight Congress, he went on what was called the swing around the circle. He went on a train tour throughout the North, arguing that he had the right idea and that Congress had the wrong idea. It had turned into a debacle. Republicans were elected in unprecedented majorities to both houses. He looked like a buffoon. Republican hecklers would meet his train when he tried to give a speech, and they would say, shut up, Andy, you know what you're talking about. And instead of acting presidential, in many cases he said, how about I come down and beat some sense into you? And had to be held by his handlers, had to be restrained from going down and engaging in fisticuffs. This is not a look of leadership that most Americans were interested in 1866. But he is still president of the United States. It gives him power. For one thing, because the military is now going to be in charge of Reconstruction, he is the commander-in-chief. And so his ability to interfere with what Congress wants these major generals to do is evident. And so first they passed the Command of the Army Act that said that all commands to officers in the field had to go through the commander of the Army, who was U.S. Grant. And so things were going to go through Grant before they went, so they hoped to kind of end run Andrew Johnson in that way. Secondly, they passed the Tenure of Office Act, which said that a president could not remove a cabinet member without Congress's authority, just like he needed their authority in order to appoint someone. Right? So just like they went through confirmation, they have to go through this so that those friendly to congressional reconstruction would not be removed from his cabinet. And Andrew Johnson took the bait, and he violated both the Command of the Army Act and the Tenure of Office Act, and in response, Congress impeached him. And so the first impeachment in our history, and indeed the last one until the late 20th century, a trial was held. I don't know if any of you have ever read Profiles in Courage. In that, there's a chapter about Senator Ross of Kansas who made the deciding vote not to convict him, and so by one vote, Andrew Johnson was not convicted of the crime and removed from office. That might be a profile in Courage, but the whole thing was cooked up. Republicans, behind the scenes while the trial went on, said to Andrew Johnson, if you wish to remain in office, you will promise not to interfere with our Reconstruction, and in response, we will leave you in the presidency, but you will not have any power to interfere with what we're doing. And he agreed to that, and so this was really a show vote to show him that they could kick him out if he further interfered with Reconstruction, and indeed, he did not engage further in Reconstruction, was not nominated by any party in 1868 to run for re-election. So he serves out the rest of his time after the impeachment trial in 1868, really a lame duck in more than name, in reality. So that was a political move. Later, for the record, the Tenure of Office Act was declared unconstitutional in the 1920s by the Supreme Court, even though no one had tried to enforce it for 50 years. But for the record, you could not do that today. So it was a political move meant to break Johnson's power, but it did in fact break his power and leave Congress in control of the process. So once they were in charge, what did they do? They did this, but they did something else. They demanded that freed men in the South be given the vote. And this is a part of our history that is largely forgotten today. And I think there are reasons why. Maybe we'll talk about that during the question and answer period. But Starting in 1867 in the fall elections, until redemption occurred in southern states, black men went to the polls and voted in large numbers. And that was a part of our history that was completely wiped out of the public memory by white Southerners until at least the Civil Rights era, and I would argue until the late 20th century. This brief period, though it was a real experiment in biracial democracy in the South. This is Harper's Weekly, one of the most influential magazines of the time, a colorized front page, and you notice this is a very calculated picture. We have a person who's a tradesman, he's got his tools in his pocket, a businessman, and a soldier. So in some ways, the cream of the Southern crop, right, of black men who are going to the polls and voting. I do find interesting, though, I'm not sure he's real pleased with what's going on, though, right? There is a certain, I think you can read this, I often have students look at this and say, what do you see? And they often see what's in the forefront, and they sort of miss that sort of gloomy figure in the background who might not be thrilled with what's happening. And they not only voted, they voted themselves into office. Between 1870 and 1876, these are black men elected to office. Alabama elected 4 black men to the U.S. House of Representatives over that time period. Georgia, Louisiana, Mississippi, South Carolina, and North Carolina also sent men. Look at the number of state legislators. It's probably more profound at the local level. For 2 years, a majority of the South Carolina state legislature was African American. Unimaginable even today, right? But in fact, 55% of the population was African American. But imagine what that looks like to an unreconstructed ex-Confederate, right? It looks like the world is falling apart. Served in the U.S. Senate, and a couple examples, served as lieutenant governor. Black men vote and hold office in the South for a brief period. And a Southern Republican Party emerges. The freed people are at its core, but there are also a couple other hated groups amongst these unreconstructed ex-Confederates. Carpetbaggers, that's still a name that has baggage to this day, right? The idea is it's a northerner who's gone into the South carrying his carpet bag so he can put all the loot he gets and take it back to the North. About 10,000 northerners moved south after the war. Many of them soldiers from the war who thought that given free labor and a new world, there were great business opportunities in the South to be had. But they're seen as people who've come to make money and fly-by-night men. They vote for the Republican Party. And scalawags, those are white Southerners willing to cooperate with this congressional reconstruction. Unionists, people who had supported the Union during the war, often become scalawags. Some urban investors and innovators, much like carpetbaggers, thought, wow, if we broke the old plantation aristocracy and we took all this energy that you can find in northern economy at the time or the western economy and could bring it into the South, there's real economic opportunity there. And honestly, there's some opportunists who said, well, if you want to hold office under congressional reconstruction, you're going to have to be a Republican for a while. Although they will become a Democrat again the minute it serves their purpose. But briefly, they will be scalawags. And there is a viable Republican Party in the South. The last thing that in the waning days of Reconstruction the Congress did was they ratified the 15th Amendment. Many felt that the 14th Amendment had guaranteed black men the right to vote because of equal citizenship, but southern states were making it very clear that it did not apply, and some northern states were even balking at the idea. So the 15th Amendment was meant to ensure that black men would have the right to vote. But you notice it is written like, sorry Russ, like a lawyer wrote them, it is not say black men have the right to vote in the United States. It says the right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. That's meant to be clear, but I think you're well aware that black men did not vote in the South for a very long time, right? So there are ways around that. For instance, what if you say that you can vote if your grandfather could vote? The so-called grandfather clause. Then we haven't broken any of those rules, but in fact, no freed person's grandfather could vote. right? So there are ways around it. Literacy tests, poll taxes. There are other ways around it as well, right? But it was meant to ensure black voting in the South to keep this Republican Party in the South viable. The other thing that happens during congressional Reconstruction, particularly under Ulysses S. Grant, and he's often not really appreciated for this fact, he very systematically and tirelessly suppressed the Klan in the South. The Klan was running amok in 1867, 1868. He suppressed it. Through the Klan Acts, particularly of 1870 and 1871, the Klan went underground. The Klan disappeared in the early 1870s, at least for the moment. And so for a while, this biracial coalition created a Republican Party and was active in the South. So then the question is, why did it all fall apart? And why did redemption occur so quickly? Well, there's several answers to that. One is, white Southerners had not given up. They'd simply been quiet for a while until they saw their chance. Their chance in some ways was Northerners growing tired of year after year of Reconstruction and this being a national issue. They got tired, they moved on, they started thinking about other things. But perhaps most critically, in 1873, the United States went into what was called a panic. I would call it a severe recession today, perhaps a depression. And when a depression comes, people start worrying about themselves and not about faraway politics. Northerners were suffering. They started to pay attention to their own lives, and they cared less and less about what was going on in the South. And at this moment, in 1873 and 74, many Southern states, former Confederate whites, realized this was their chance. And they realized what they had to do is win one election to take control back of the state government, and that's what they began to do. In state after state, particularly it happens as early as 1869 in some states, but most states it happened in 1873 to 1877. White politicians, Democrat politicians, go to the polls and they say, people, Reconstruction's been a failure. We're spending a lot of money on black folks who don't deserve it. We're spending a lot of money on improvements we don't need, like hospitals and roads and things, and it's wasteful. The federal government shouldn't be telling us what to do, and having black men rule us is an abomination. And then the Ku Klux Klan served as sort of a paramilitary arm of the Southern Democratic Party. They terrorized black voters and their allies. And in state after state, Democrats, white supremacist Democrats who were former Confederates, won the state back. And once they did, they began to systematically undo congressional Reconstruction. And it is instructive, I think, to notice that they called themselves redeemers, which has a religious tone to it. They saw what they were doing as a crusade to save the South from Northern oppression and black rule. 3 states remained unredeemed in 1876, Louisiana, Florida, and South Carolina. In that election, Democrats and Republicans sent disputed votes, electoral votes, to Washington, D.C. It looked like the Democrat would be elected, but if Rutherford Hayes could gain all of the disputed electoral votes, he would win the election by 1 electoral vote. And behind closed doors, a bargain was struck, and the deal was this. If Southerners allowed the Republicans to win the election and control the federal government, the South could redeem itself. Northerners would stop demanding change in the South, stop demanding that African American rights be respected, and Southerners would be allowed to do what they wanted to do. And that was the compromise of 1877. Those last 3 states were redeemed, went back into control of white Democrats, and Reconstruction came to an end. Black voting then was constantly under attack. Almost no black man was voting in the South by the 1880s, and the last were really voting. By 1900, no black men were voting in the South. And of course, it would be a time that some of you remember in the 1960s when really in large numbers African Americans began to regain the vote in the South. That's why Foner, by the way, called it an unfinished revolution. I would also argue, and I won't go too hard on this because I lived more comfortably in the 19th century, certain Southern politicians make some of the same arguments about the federal government today that their ancestors were making 140 years ago, about the big bad federal government who spends too much money, takes away our rights, and pays way too much attention to people who ought not to be made attention to. Those arguments echo to me when I hear them made today, even though that the voices I'm more familiar with come from the 1860s and 1870s. And the reality is, the United States decided, and Northerners are involved in this too, I'll end with this, white Northerners decide to make that decision. They decide to abandon the black men and the freed people who had been their allies during the war, who had been their allies after the war, abandon them to a century of Klan violence, lynchings, sharecropping, and Jim Crow. And that was a decision Northerners made too. So I don't want to just beat up on white Southerners. White Northerners were implicitly involved in that decision. And so all those decisions of the world that could have been made in the 1860s and 70s was deferred for a century. And in some ways, we still deal with the legacies of what happened so long ago. Thank you very much.